So the short story of these voyages is that in the early 1400s, a new young emperor of China chose to create the largest armada the world had seen for a number of reasons. One is he probably came to the throne as a result of killing his nephew who had been placed on the throne. So he was a usurper. And you don't want to be an emperor known as a usurper. So he's going to try to chase him down. He was also very activist, and he wanted to show the flag that after we've gotten rid of the damn Mongols, is there anybody else in the world out there who can challenge the glory and power of the great Ming Empire? And so he ordered these vessels built in this armada. And so from 1402 to 1405, there was a rush of shipbuilding on China's southeast coast. Much of the southeast coast was in fact deforested to build these ships. 120 or so ships were built. And over the next 20 years or so until 1433, there were 7 of these voyages of Zheng He, heading out into the South Oceans and then mostly heading through the Straits of Malacca into the Indian Ocean, into the Red Sea and Arabia, and down to the east coast of Africa. There's a number of elements and things that happened here. The Chinese, the Ming, used this to establish their superiority over all of the known world, and brought back ambassadors from all these places, and including Korea and Japan and the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. They would come back and spend a year in the capital city in Beijing, which was constructed by this guy as well. So the current imperial city in Beijing was constructed in the early 1400s along the same time. I don't have any images of this, but you just Google Imperial Palace, and that's what was built in 1400. And they're brought back to say, we are the most powerful force on earth. Look at this Imperial Palace. Isn't that proof enough? So they're doing that. They're creating a world with China at the center. They are collecting botanical supplies and examples all around the world and bringing it back to the gardens. They're collecting animals of all different kinds and bringing them back. They're collecting giraffes. We've got some pretty interesting images of giraffes. They're collecting no rhinoceros. The rhinoceros is kind of difficult to control, right? You got other things. But so there's, like the Europeans did in the 19th century with botanical gardens and all their collecting of resources as well, that the Chinese were doing. The other thing the Chinese did, which is not often part of the story, but they used their military power on these armadas to depose rulers who were not friendly to them, and to put rulers in place who were friendly to them. You know, an imperialist action. They got rid of the leader of this little trading town of Malacca, dispatched him, and put in power somebody who was much more friendly to the Chinese. And then in the part of the world that we now call Sri Lanka, they did the same thing to the king of Sri Lanka, got rid of him, put in somebody more favorable to him there. So they were not afraid to use military power to get their way. But ultimately what they discovered is that there really was no military force out there that posed any threat to them whatsoever. Mostly what we know, and this is work that people on the Indian Ocean trading circuits have done, mostly the traders, the maritime traders in the Indian Ocean, were peaceful traders who thought that the way trade worked is, you've got something I want, I've got something you want, I give you that, we agree on that, we shake hands, yeah, then I phone for $1. But got a deal, go away, right? Trade was on the basis of peace, and people didn't use arms to do that. So there's a lot of ships out here, but they're trade, and this is the engine of much of the exchange of the previous map of those 8 world circuits of trade is being generated by all this activity in the south. Now, I want to point out one other thing while I'm looking at this in terms of contemporary stuff. These voyages are the basis for China's current claims to, let's see, we've got Taiwan here, we've got the Philippines here, Indonesia here. So this China currently has drawn what they call the 9-dashed line in the South China Sea. And they claim this, and this is where they are building those islands in the South China Sea. It's rather specific, and that's their claim, historic claim, to that being their territory. They brought that, the Philippines brought a claim against them 2 or 3 years ago to the International Court of Arbitration. I forgot the exact name, and the International Court rendered a decision in 2015 that said, China, you have no basis for claims for this as being your territory. But they're doing it anyway, just to tell you where they're going. So the Chinese have this entire space all the way over to the east coast of Africa under their control. Now, here's another image of that with the various trade circles and cycles. This comes from an article in the Journal of World History that, again, if you can get it, take a look at it. The article is pretty interesting.
Where do we get the information again about these voyages? Because they didn't know about it for a while.
I'm gonna get to that at the very end, and it's sort of good news and bad news. But that's the end. We'll get there. So this is, all dominated by Chinese military power in the 1400s, from 1405 to 1433, and then some interesting things happen in 1433. For a set of reasons that have to do with court politics in China and the death of the emperor who put these voyages out there, there was a struggle in the Chinese court between those who were Confucian fundamentalists who thought that all energy and time and resources ought to be lavished on creating China as the most agriculturally self-sustainable empire. And so, getting back to that agriculture story, there was another group that had supported the voyages. These were merchants, they were eunuchs, and they were a few other things, and they lost out. And so the new regime in 1434, 1435 simply ordered all the Navy back into port, refused to allow it to go, allowed the ships to rot, collected all the documents on these voyages and burned them. That's getting to the question of what do we know and how do we know about that. So this is that moment. This is that contingency, and I want to just take this out a little bit. Until 1433, China had the largest navy in the world in the Indian Ocean. For reasons that had nothing to do with anything else, but had to do with the politics within China, they choose to withdraw their navy from the Indian Ocean. And the Indian Ocean is gone the Chinese Navy is gone in 1433. Now, I've got up here another date, because in the 1415, the guy who becomes known as Henry the Navigator begins trying to figure out how to get to Asia. He gets his caravels, he learns how to do some blue water sailing, and starts heading down the coast of Africa. And there's some interesting stories about what's going on and what the Portuguese are doing here, especially with the Cape Verde Islands up there and other things. But by 1434, the Portuguese they've only gotten to the west coast of Africa. They're not even in the Gold Coast or any of the other slaving parts. They're just up here. China was here, 1433, they remove it. Diaz begins to continue to move down, and Portuguese get to what becomes the Cape of Good Hope by 1488. We know what happens in 1492. Columbus sails that way. The Portuguese say, get your ass in there, among other things. Now, the caravels that the Portuguese had were the same size and nature of the Santa Maria, what are they? There you go. You all know that. I only know some of them. But they're basically the same thing. So I'm going to give you an image or two that will show you what the Chinese Admiralty ships looked like compared to the ones that Diaz and then Columbus are sailing. And then we can think about what would happen if they met down here or up here. This is the treasure ship of the Chinese Admiral Zheng, and here is a Portuguese caravel. Actually, I think that's the Santa Maria. Okay, so these vessels are 400 feet long, 150 feet wide. The masts, this one is showing them with the yellow masts. The masts are about 150 feet high. There are 9 masts. The other descriptions that we have of them is that the sails were made out of red silk. So if you think of red silk. And this is at the head of a fleet of 120 other vessels, 27,000 sailors, marines, and others. And there might have been 3 of these vessels. Admiral Zheng is on this one. And some of the other vessels, they had marines. Marines are used for landing and then getting on, and they had horses, they had cavalry, they got the military might. And I want you to also get into the whole section of Chinese shipbuilding. This ship is made with watertight compartments. The whole hull is made out of watertight compartments. If you look back here, it's not immediately obvious what's behind door 3, but anybody want to take a guess what the Chinese have that can poke out here? Cannons. Cannons. So that navy is withdrawn and all of its military power, allowing the Portuguese to sail around the Cape of Good Hope, and then in 1498 to sail to Calicut in India, and then into the South China Sea, opening the way first for the Portuguese, then the English come, the next wave, and then the French, and then others as well. So this Europe at the center, all these voyages of discovery really have to be put into the context of the contingency that they were possible only because of the decisions made by the Chinese in 1434. If not, the Europeans would not have had what turned out to be true. They would not have had a global monopoly on sailing ships and knitting together the world in the 1540s, 30s, and 40s. There could have been another world. There was nothing that would have prevented the Chinese, who had the capability of sailing around the Cape of Good Hope into and through the Straits of Malacca, and saying, imagine 120 ships with the with the Admiral's flagship heading through there. Okay, now I'm going to get to the question. Let's see. I forgot your name. Lindley. Okay. Are we going to do a DBQ workshop based on this? No. Why not? Sources. This is a collection. Oh, you can't see this very well. The Chinese, this was put together and published, I think, in 2011 or 2012. There is a Chinese collection of sources about Zheng He's voyages, but there's none of them have been translated. There's a couple of books on Zheng He that are pretty good and use other sources, but mostly some of these are Chinese secondary sources. This is a pretty famous one, Louise Levathes, who did this one 10, 12 years or so ago. It's very readable and you can use it. This is his name Dreyer is well chosen. It's a Dreyer view of everything else. He's from the University of Minnesota. Good colleague, good friend. He knows what he's doing. But as far as I know, there's nothing like the sources that I've been able to give you for these other things to think about Zheng He and this incredible turning point in world history that makes it possible for Portuguese and Spanish to circumnavigate the globe.
Where did they find what they had,
Yeah,
though?
we found some documents. We found archaeological evidence. The harbors where they were built have been put together and excavated. And China has, in 2025, it was the 600th anniversary, and so there was a huge effort in 25 to gather everything that they could and begin putting it together, and that's what's in here. But we're on the edge of having the documents.